Hello. So the last couple of weeks, month or so, I've been reading this book, amongst others. This is The Last Days of John Lennon. Now, I've read a few John Lennon biographies in my time. Actually, I was looking through a list, and I've read more than I thought I had, but a lot of them were a long time ago, a good 20 years ago. I've mentioned before, I kind of went through like this as I tend to do, went through kind of an obsessive period of certain bands or artists. And I remember would have been about the year 2000, 2001. I went through a real Beatles period. It was about the time George Harrison passed away. Um, and uh, and I read a lot of Beatles stuff around that time. And I remember I read one similar to this, which was called, like, I can't remember the exact title, but it was like this was the last days of John Lennon. It was like, I don't know, the it wasn't the last days, obviously. It was something similar to that. The the end of John Lennon's life, or the final days of John Lennon's life, or the ending of yeah, I can't remember. Whatever. There was another book, uh, which again that would have been a good 20 years ago, and from my memory, that was a better book. It kind of it delved deeper. This was not really what I expected it to be. Firstly, if you want, in my opinion, the best John Lennon biography is the one that was done by Philip Norman relatively recently, I think. Um, I don't know where exact year, but at least I read it recently. Um, I don't know if it was a second edition, if it maybe it was released earlier. Yeah, Philip Norman. It was 2019. I read it before COVID, so it must have been around 2019, maybe 2018. Anyway, what I'm saying is there's better books out there. This, uh, despite what the name says, it actually doesn't particularly focus on his last days at all. Um, when I first started reading it, I thought it was going to start, in 1980, or maybe the late 70s to build some kind of context, but it doesn't. It goes right back to when he was a kid and goes through the whole thing, growing up in Liverpool, all the stuff you'd expect, meeting Paul and the Beatles. It doesn't. It kind of does switch back, I think, from time to time. Yeah, see, like kind of there, it'll go back and write from the perspective of Mark Chapman, but I don't think that really adds anything to the book at all. It's like I kind of after I finished it, even while I was reading, I was like, well, I don't see what this book really adds to anything to do with the last days of John Lennon. Um, I don't even know why it was really titled that way. So yeah, it'll have a chapter every now and then interspersed rather as kind of a general biography. See, there we go again, December 6th, 1980, and it'll be about Mark Chapman and hanging out in New York, hanging outside the Dakota and waiting for John to come out Um, but I kind of those chapters they're usually pretty short and they don't really add anything. There's nothing new exposed. There's no new information. Um, it's not particularly interesting. I think writing from Mark Chapman's point of view isn't interesting because I guess some people are kind of interested in the macabre and getting inside the mind of someone who is clearly mentally ill, um, just for whatever reason. But everything I've read about Mark Chapman has been decidedly uninteresting. I'm not saying that like I expect my killers to be interesting and like as though it's like kind of a form of entertainment. But what I'm saying is that if you're going to write a whole book and kind of try to put that point of view into it of the killer, you'd think that you'd be offering something at least novel and partly interesting, and I don't feel like it is at all. But in saying that, just the book itself, it's the biography of John himself is fine. It's serviceable. It's all been written before, though. It's all taken from earlier books and other interviews. It kind of a lot of the stuff that when Paul is quoted, that obviously he didn't interview Paul directly, the author, James Patterson. It refers back to this 2019 interview with Paul, and I'm not exactly sure what that was from, because I tried to look back into the biblical, or the footnotes or whatever you call it, and it was didn't actually say what the interview was. But yeah, so it seemed like in that interview, Paul was talking quite candidly and open about John. And yeah, so I'd be kind of somewhat interested to follow up on that particular interview. But yeah. In the way of CDs that I own of John Lennon, without the Beatles, this is all I have. I have a greatest hits thing that I got secondhand a couple of years ago for $1.50. You can see the tag still on it. And this is everything at least all his bigger songs that he did after leaving the Beatles, from Imagine onwards. Look, there was the original price, $33.95. This was released in 1997. How do I feel about John's solo stuff? I think all of the Beatles solo stuff has got its good points, and they've all managed to write some really good songs solo. But even at their best, nothing as good as the best of the Beatles, but that's to be expected. John's solo stuff is maybe, well, I guess I'm comparing Paul, George, and John, and I'm leaving Ringo out of it because Ringo is not, obviously, I'm not like saying anything revolutionary here. Ringo is not in the same songwriting league as the other three. He's not in the same songwriting league as he's not. He doesn't actually write that much music. A lot of the songs that he on the albums were written by other people, or I think even John wrote some and George wrote some. Like Photograph, which I think when number one was written, Ringo and George Harrison in 1973. I think that one of the other ones was with John. I think John gave him some songs and he didn't actually use them. Okay, I was going to say Don't Come Easy. That was okay, 1970. I would have guessed that was much later. That was Ringo Starr, produced by George Harrison. So okay, I shouldn't say he had no ability whatsoever. That's not fair. But what I'm saying is that obviously the other three are kind of like in the top tier of greatest songwriters ever. And so if I was to compare the post Beatles work of Paul, George, and John, I kind of found John's to be the least interesting for me personally. And maybe I'm saying that it's probably the one that I've listened to least out of all three. Like I've listened to a lot of Paul's stuff that he did with Wings and solo. I listened to All Things Must Pass and Dark Horse from George Harrison a lot, and bits and pieces throughout the other stuff he did in the 80s as well. But John, I think I only ever really listened to this kind of stuff, the singles, the stuff that you would hear on the radio, and that when I hear that song Imagine, for example, that is kind of almost like something like a Hey Jude or a Let It Be, a song that I've heard, or Yesterday, a song that I've heard so many times and has been overused so much that it kind of loses itself. And that's not John's fault, obviously, writing a classic song. But then the other stuff, like for example Instant Karma, I like Instant Karma, but he used some really I don't know, not nice production techniques. And I know that he was famously didn't like his own voice, and so used to kind of multi-track it And I don't know if that's what it's doing, but if you listen to that song Instant Karma, the effect on the vocals, it's the whole thing kind of sounds so tinny. Um, but I'm saying that a lot of the others, I'm like kind of looking through this as I go down. There's a lot of really good songs on there. He has written "Jealous Guy," "Mind Games," "Whatever Gets You Through the Night." That's the one that he wrote. Is that the one he wrote about Paul McCartney? Or is that? No, that's "How Do You Sleep," isn't it? Maybe both of them. "Beautiful Boy." That's a nice song. "Just Like Starting Over," "Woman." So yeah, there's a lot. But again, yeah, like that song "Woman." It's a bit schmaltzy. I was actually listening to that recently, and like it's in some way it's a good song. It's a well written song, but again, maybe it's just you tie so many these things to kind of how you've heard them throughout your life, and kind of associate that song with your easy listening radio, and that can be both a positive and negative thing. Um, there was that other song of his that a lot of people refer to as kind of one of his great works, and that's that song "God." This is his first post Beatles solo album, the John Lennon Plastic Ono Band. Um, it was released at the end of 1970, and I've heard people talk about that. And I also listened to a Song Exploder. I think it was Song Exploder. If you know Song Exploder, it's like kind of a mini podcast that takes one song and kind of breaks down the writing process, usually together with the songwriter. And I haven't actually listened to a episode of that for a long time, because most of the music that they put on that now, I have no idea what it is by artists who I don't know. But if you go back, they've done some really good ones. They did uh, what are the good songs? They did the Mob Deep song, "Shook Ones." That was a really interesting one, kind of going through how they did the sample, how they found the sample, and kind of the way they slowed it down to match the beat. They actually Song Exploder has actually done a Netflix series as well, where they actually kind of it's the visual element as well, and they did "Losing My Religion" by REM, which again that was a good episode. There are some good songs that they put on there and interesting things, and one of them was this John Lennon song "God," and I think that was the first time I ever heard it. What is on the Song Exploder episode, and I'd heard it being talked about so much, and I just didn't get it. I did. I mean, I didn't get the song. I mean, I didn't get the hype about that song. I just yeah, didn't think much of that song at all. The Song Exploder breakdown interviewed Klaus Vormann, who is worked with the Beatles, at least some, but he also worked a lot with John in his solo era. He played the bass on it. I think he was kind of going in depth talking about it. But yeah, I don't know. That song was kind of represents my overall feeling about John's solo stuff. Kind of a lot of hullabaloo, but then when it comes down to actually listen, I find that I don't. It doesn't really do it for me personally. But again, if you go through that track listing there of his best of, and it's some absolute classic songs. Um, and that's what it was a lot in the book was talking about, was his the mental barrier of following up the Beatles is always going to be a struggle. And the fact that he really only worked for 5 years is only that's only 5 years of material, because, or I guess 6 maybe, because he left the Beatles. The Beatles ended in 1970. He released albums through 70 to 75, and then he took basically 4 or 5 years off when Sean was born, his son with Yoko, and didn't really do anything for that period. And then just before he died, he came back with Double Fantasy, and kind of I think it was another 1 or 2 albums at the end of his life. Okay, Milk and Honey was posthumous. That was 4 years after he died. But he actually did quite. So he released 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75. Geez, an album a year for 7 years. At the same time, at the end of that, doing the Beatles at the same time. Then 5 year gap, and then 1980, Double Fantasy. Um, so yeah, if you take all those songs and compress them into like kind of 5 year, 5 or 6 year stint of songwriting, it is you know still a pretty amazing thing. Yeah. What else can I really say? Not much. I guess reading the book also, you're reminded of John's, I guess, the negative side of his personality. He could be a bit of a prick. Like, there's the whole thing with Yoko. And for a long time, I would say I was as guilty of this as anyone else. People kind of blaming her for the end of the Beatles, and that she kind of controlled John, and she was this malevolent force in his life. But for reading the book, and again, other books I've read, it been somewhat similar to lesser or greater degrees, that he wasn't particularly nice to her. There was one, when was it? There was, I think it was before, he had that lost weekend period where he went away to LA for 1 or 2 or a year and a half, and he kind of left, or Yoko kicked him out, or he left Yoko, depending which way you look at it, and she set him up to stay with the personal assistant May Pang. Before that happened, he was just kind of like openly cheating on her in front of her face. There was one particular part of the book, I can't remember what it was, for some reason. I think he some song he had written had not got to what he'd wanted it. Anyway, they were at a party, went to the party together, and then he just walked in and kind of picked up a girl, not like physically picked her up, but picked her up, and they went to the room and you know had it off, and the whole party could hear it happening, and Yoko's sitting on the couch, you know absolutely mortified, being embarrassed. Can you think of anything more embarrassing than your husband going off in front of your face, and then everyone knowing what happened, and everyone going to hear it happening? um he was a bit like, he was very, caustic, very kind of, didn't really seem to care about offending people at all. And I guess that could, was part of his brilliance, but also his part of his failing. And anytime you read these things, you come out thinking, I don't know, maybe Paul McCartney's has got the best PR team on earth, but even if the book is not intending for that to come out, it comes out of Paul just looking like like a saint in comparison. Like when John left his wife Cynthia and their son Julian, how John didn't really give a shit. He just took off and went off with Yoko, and then it was Paul who went and kind of consoled Cynthia and was spending time with Julian, and eventually wrote the song "Hey Jude," which was about Julian, and spent. I think Julian Lennon has said that he felt like Paul was more of a father figure to him growing up than John ever was. And in the book, there is some kind of, towards the end of his life, there is more of a reconciliation between John and Julian, especially when he's in LA away from Yoko. And that's hard to know whether, was she the one who wanted there to be no relationship between him and his son? I don't know. But yeah, he certainly doesn't come out of this looking like a particularly good person. But at the same time, he doesn't come out looking, you don't think, oh, he's an evil prick. Most of that stuff, if you've even read a little bit about the Beatles, it's all pretty, out there public knowledge. So yeah, I would say, if you're going to actually bother reading something about John Lennon and you haven't, I would give this book a miss. It doesn't offer any particular new insight. It tries to use this kind of storytelling device by interspersing, past and future time things together and looking from the point of view of the killer, but it doesn't do it in a particularly interesting way. And there are much better things out there, such as the biography by Philip Norman. And actually, I might just look right now, hang on, for that particular book about before he died. There's two. Okay. There's Nowhere Man, The Final Days of John Lennon. That's the one I've read. And it says, written by one of the few people outside John Lennon's inner circle to have read his personal diaries. And it focuses on that period during, the double fantasy album recording of that, and just as that's getting released. And there's another one here. I'm not sure I have heard of this. The Last Days of John Lennon, which is also the subtitle of this one. But this is by Frederick Seaman, a personal memoir. Seaman was John Lennon's personal assistant. Okay, I haven't read this. Driver and companion from 1979 until his death. His memoir includes Lennon's virtual imprisonment in his apartment, his obsession with food and sex, the Lennon's colossal shopping sprees, John and Yoko's fascination with the occult, and John's premonition. Okay, it could be mildly interesting, kind of getting a personal insight from his PA. Never actually heard of that before. I'm surprised I've never heard or seen that anywhere. So yeah, I'd say there are better things, more interesting things to read out there than this James Patterson book. Not terrible, but nothing particularly interesting. Alrighty, we'll leave it there. Thanks for watching.